Well, joining me now in New York is Diego Arria. He's a Venezuelan politician and a former representative to the UN. He was also with Juan Guaido and accompanied him at the Colombian border. Sir, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Were you surprised that Guaido was not arrested upon his return?
No, I was not. I even made a statement saying that the regime would not dare to put his hands on top of him, would not dare to touch him because of the international repercussions and the fear that some countries might take some harsher actions.
Mm-hmm. Now that he's back, Guaido has called on his supporters to mobilize on Saturday because, as he said in a tweet, all the support we have and all the support we need will depend on whether we stay in the streets. He wants strikes. He wants people to paralyze the public sector. How can that be helpful when people are struggling to find food to eat, to paralyze the public sector? Isn't that going to lead to more suffering?
Well, the public sector is not producing anything. The public sector, on the contrary, is very heavy on the many people that are completely unneeded. And it is important that after returning to Venezuela, we continue the pressure on the regime. And the only pressure that you can have a civilian population that is not armed is actually stopping many of the regime's activities. The only way. And it will keep the pressure and the enthusiasm of people that for about 90% reject the Maduro regime.
As a supporter of Guaido and as somebody who's pushing for change, there's a belief from Maduro and his supporters that while people are suffering, you and Guaido and your allies and the United States and others are weaponizing the need for humanitarian change. You're weaponizing the idea of humanitarian aid as a guise for regime change. Address that for me, please, sir.
Well, that's absolutely absurd. To weaponize food, actually, the regime is doing that. The little food that there is in the country, they use it to provide to some of the people who they believe are their followers. No, a humanitarian assistance being called by the international community as a right action to take. The United Nations, the Food Program, the European Union, the United States, everybody. The only one who came up with that absurd idea of weaponizing food is the Maduro regime.
And the UN Secretary General Guterres has said that he wants all parties to conduct dialogue to end the political impasse. Of course, the cynic would say this is what the UN Secretary General would say, whether it's Guterres or Kofi Annan or Ban Ki-moon or whoever. But let me ask you, sincerely, would you sit down with Maduro and try to resolve this with dialogue?
You know, you were absolutely right. Any Secretary General, any diplomat are forced to use a sort of the decalogue. Negotiations, sit at the table, both parties must negotiate. You know, we have tried that in the last 3 or 4 years. Venezuelan politicians have attempted to sit at the table. But you know something? It is very difficult to sit down when there is no government on the other side. When there is a band of criminals, many of them linked to narco-trafficking, and it is very difficult and actually unprecedented to sit down and speak to a regime that has morphed into a narco state. It is actually a very hard thing to do.
Was it a mistake in declaring Guaido president from your side?
According to our constitution, actually, when Guaido became the president of the National Assembly, he swore that he was going to fulfill his duties. So when he became automatically the president, when there was a void, a vacuum in the power, already he was sworn in to do that. Maybe he should have done it also, but he's not self-proclaimed. He was proclaimed by the Venezuelan constitution that automatically declared him president as soon as Maduro was out.
Maduro believes that the United States is behind a coup attempt using Guaido, using you and all the other Venezuelans who are anti-Maduro. Your response to that is what?
Well, the Maduro regime, as Chavez before, have been saying that for almost 20 years. They blame the United States on anything that happens in Venezuela, even though the United States is the only country that pays for the oil that Venezuela produces. That's not the case. You know, the countries, for example, the United States, have been trying to push him through sanctions. But it's not only the United States. Now, many of the countries of the European Union, many of the countries in Latin America are enforcing sanctions because they see Venezuela as a threat, not only to us, the Venezuelans, but a threat to regional stability.
Are you afraid that all of this might lead to civil war because both sides are doubling down?
No, really. You know, I've seen civil wars, and it's not the case in Venezuela, where you only have one side is armed, fully armed, not only with the armed forces. Because remember, we don't have armed forces. The government of the regime, the Venezuelan regime, is a military regime, and the civilians are completely unarmed. So a civil war only takes place when both sides are armed. That's not the case in Venezuela.
And what do you make of the fact that while Guaido is calling for strikes and demonstrations, Maduro is calling for strikes or demonstrations to counter them as well, anti-imperialist demonstrations? Aren't we going to see trouble on the streets?
No, every time that the opposition lead protests in the streets, immediately the regime tries to do the same at the same hour, the same day. But there's no way they can actually counter that. When you have a rejection of almost 90% of the country that is against you, you'll find very little people. And actually, the few people who attended the regime's protests were public members of the public administration. They will start disappearing soon, and you will see how thin is the support that the narco regime of Maduro has today.
As an experienced diplomat, somebody who's supporting Guaido, yes, we see that the United States, many of the Europeans, the Colombians, the Brazilians, the Argentinians, they are supporting Guaido. But what's your message as a diplomat to those who are supporting President Maduro, to the countries such as Turkey, to the countries such as Russia? What's your message to them?
You know, to see Russia has attempted to include Venezuela into a sort of a Cold War to confront the United States using the case of Venezuela. I think the Russians couldn't care less for us, for our welfare, whether we starve or not. They care to see if they can carve a niche in the Western Hemisphere to try to confront in one way or another the United States. China more moderate and more moderate in its attitude than Russia, but Russia really is really unforgivable what they have done. Actually, recently in the Security Council, it looked more a confrontation with the United States than a defense of the Venezuelan cause or the Maduro regime.
Diego Arria, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Well, let's bring in two new guests now. Joining us now from Toronto is Alessandra Polga. She's the Canada spokeswoman for the opposition Vente Venezuela party. And in Caracas, we have Paul Dobson. He's a journalist at Venezuela Analysis. Thanks both of you for joining us. Paul, you heard the interview with Diego Arria. Do you disagree with him?
I would on a number of factors. Here in Venezuela, I think we see and feel very different power dynamics, maybe from what he sees and feels in his base outside of the country. I think it's very important to highlight that any basic reading of the Venezuelan constitution, I mean basic here is in a quick reading, deeper reading even more so, will show that there is basically no constitutional groundwork for Juan Guaido to be named president. For him to be named interim president, he would have to prove with evidence that there is an abandonment of power. And this obviously hasn't happened. I think it's very important that we don't confuse the fact that maybe Diego Arias and Juan Guaido don't like the policies of Nicolas Maduro and the fact that there are policies, there is a president, there is actions, there is a government taking place here in Venezuela. So to claim that there is an abandonment of power is, in my mind, entirely political and has no constitutional grounding whatsoever.
Alessandra Polga, there's no abandonment of power. That's why Guaido is illegitimate, according to Paul. What do you make of that?
I completely disagree with what he said, because our constitution is very clear. More than 52 countries, they did not recognize the sham election that tried to do that Maduro did last year in 2018, because first of all, the election had to be called for the National Assembly and then had to be notified for the Minister of Election, that's CNE. And what has not happened is something that Maduro announced on TV, and then the director of the CNA called for the election. There is not international observation, is outside of the rule of law in Venezuela. And the result is the more than 52 countries, included 11 countries of the Organization of American States and Europe, and not just, again, that continue with the topic of the United States, but many countries reject the results. And when you don't have a new president elected in our constitution under the Article 233 and 333 and 350, you can allow that, and you need to cover the power, the absence of power.
Right. Okay, so I just want to sort of move beyond the question of political legitimacy and the legalities of it, because there's clearly a reality on the ground of a very divided nation. Well, according to Diego Arria, 90% of the people are actually against Maduro. It's difficult for us to actually figure that one out and verify that. But Alessandra, what we have is Nicolas Maduro saying, I'm president, I'm not going to step down. So then what? What for your movement? If he's going to stay in his role no matter what are you going to do?
Of course, he's going to try to keep the power, because we have to remember that it's not a democratic government, it's a criminal state, it's a regime. Those guys are involved, deeply involved in international criminal. The cousins of his wife, they are detained. They are in jail right now in the United States for trafficking drugs. And more of the high ranks of the army are related with this cartel, the cartel of the soles. It's because is the symbol of the general, the soles in the shoulders. And they are related with the international terrorism. It's very proof for many reports around the world that we are on a training place from Hezbollah and Hamas, and that thing started with the Vice President Tarek al-Aissami, that he's really directed with Hamas and Hezbollah, and they are now trafficking not just with drugs, they are trafficking with weapons, they are trafficking with people, and then they are in a threat from the hemisphere. That is the reason why they had to be in the power to protect his life.
Okay, so Paul Dobson, Alessandra paints this picture of not a government, but basically a cabal of narco traffickers, right? And that's the view from the opposition. You're an outsider living in Venezuela for a period of time. Is that what you see?
Listen, I think it's very important to try and be objective here. No, obviously, if you speak to a politician on Juan Guaido's side, or a representative, as Alessandra is, they will give you the line of Juan Guaido, and from far away, what they are told by their allies is happening here. Here on the ground in Venezuela, as an objective, independent observer, things are very different, I think. In all of my time in Venezuela, I've never seen any Hamas or Hezbollah training camp. And it's also worth pointing out that both Hamas and Hezbollah are legal political parties in their countries. No? So, here in Venezuela, what we do see is one reality based on the streets, based on concrete facts, and at times a different reality, which is what is discussed in the White House, which is what is discussed in Bogota.
Okay, so in terms
an example of this, for example,
Paul, what is the reality? Is the reality that Maduro's government has wrecked the economy and that's why we are where we are, and that's why the country is divided? Or is it everything that he says it is, that it's an outside plot?
I would say it's probably a combination of both. Being objective about it, there are obviously cases of malmanagement of the economy, but there is also very clear evidence of the impact of hoarding, of extraction smuggling, and also of the US-led sanctions against the economy. The US-led oil embargo, which was announced in January, is due to cost the Venezuelan economy $30 million a day. And at the same time, the US pretend to send about just $20 million of so-called aid into the country. So here we can really see the impact of the sanctions on the Venezuelan economy. Obviously, the economy is not helped by issues like corruption and mismanagement. But I think if we blame just the US government or just the Maduro government, it's far too simplistic.
Okay, Alessandra, is Paul an objective observer?
We have to be clear in many points. First of all, the first sanctions posed that the government to Venezuela are against personals and individuals person. It's not for economical sanctions. Just recently, 15 days ago, is the one directly for the income and the revenue come from Citgo. 15 days. We have the list. The list as following the list. It's the sanction who apply United States are following for Canada and are following for some countries in Europe. I have the list. And secondly, we are not talking why is the reason we are in this point in Venezuela, because we have a huge level of corruption in Venezuela, a lack of proper administration. Before, when Chavez won in 1999, we received $12 per barrel, and after and in 2000 Chavez started to receive $170 per barrel. And then they disappear all the income, and that price it stay in the market probably for 6 years, and they stolen everything. You have the high level corruption in the war.
Okay.
Right now.
Okay.
And
okay.
because they just a second, let me
okay.
finish a little bit. I'm going to be fast. Sorry. And because they arrest the national production, they have to be forced to import everything. And because they own money to every company around the world because they stole the resources, that is the shortest that we have right now in Venezuela.
Paul, when Guaido says, quote, they thought the pressure had reached its zenith, but it's only just beginning, what does that mean to you?
It sounds to me like politicians talk. When you look at the events of the last month and a half, it's my evaluation that Guaido is actually losing political momentum. This is also backed up by the fact that the government decided not to take any legal steps against him when he re-entered the country on Monday, clearly not seeing him as any sort of real threat. When we look at the promises which Guaido has made to the country, he hasn't actually been able to fulfill a single one of those. When we look at the reaction of the Lima group in Bogota a few weeks ago, they actually turned their back.
Paul, how does he fulfill
How
does he fulfill the promises if he's not in charge?
Well, this is a point. He declared himself president, yet he's no closer to actually being the president. He hasn't explained to anyone how he pretends to actually take control of any of the institutions of state or the power of the country. He hasn't laid out any sort of roadmap where we see a plausible way for him to actually do this. So his supporters here on the ground are starting to think, is this just another man who speaks a good talk but doesn't really fulfill what we want to happen?
Okay, fragile situation in Venezuela. For the moment, he's back, he's on the streets, he's called for that strike all over the weekend. We'll be keeping a close eye on it and possibly having another look at Venezuela next week. But for the moment, let me thank both of you, Alessandra Polga and Paul Dobson, and earlier Diego Arria. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.